What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. John Krofsick and Larry Rifkin. We hope that you are well. And John, have you ever had a fight with someone who is a skeptic about the existence of a higher being?
I have had conversations about that with people, yes.
Those are tough
Those
conversations
are tough.
to have.
They are very tough conversations.
But I mean, do you try to proselytize? Do you try to bring them to your position?
Still, being I like science, I even myself sometimes I wrestle with that, with science on how, did we just evolve or is there a greater being? I mean, everybody's got to ask themselves.
What about the garden of Adam and Eve? I mean, did that exist, John? I mean,
I don't know.
What kind of tale is that?
It's quite a tale.
Well, let's be honest, John. I mean, I pray, or I try to pray most nights, having been brought up in a faith and still part of that faith. But sometimes I find it tough. Three of the people that I had in my prayers just a couple of weeks ago, they all died.
Yeah.
And now I'm left wondering whether anyone's listening or whether the prayers really have any effect. I mean, again, I think we're always questioning this.
I find myself always questioning it, whether, like I said, is there something beyond here or is this it? I mean, I don't know. Nobody's ever come back to tell me. So,
well, that's what makes it so hard to argue. And again, our guest today, Dr. William Irwin, he says that God is a question and not an answer. Now, we just did a podcast that we posted with a great man of questions, but I think this is the greatest question of all. Is there an afterlife?
So this is a beautiful question?
Oh, this is profoundly beautiful, except that it's caused such rancor and ugliness over the years with so many people fighting over it, and nobody can say, I'm right and you're wrong, but let's have a war over it. Does that make any sense?
You see, that's crazy. But my God's better than your God. I mean, it's just nuts.
So, are you going to take off that bumper sticker you have, militant agnostic? I don't know, and you don't either. No. So let's not fight over it. Let's get some answers.
Let's do that.
Or let's ask some more profound questions. Again, William Irwin, a professor at King's College. The fascinating new book he has, God is a Question, Not an Answer, helping us to find common ground in this a major area of uncertainty in our lives. With us on the line is Dr. William Irwin, author of God is a Question, Not an Answer, Finding Common Ground in Our Uncertainty. And lots of people have waged war and debate and have been very much entangled in conflict over this question, if you will, of God, no God. And why is it that you think we've gotten so intense and emotional about this question?
Well, I suppose, Larry, that a lot hangs on the question for people. Certainly for the religious believer, having the correct belief may seem to be linked to eternal life or eternal damnation, and on the opposing side, lots of non-believers grow very frustrated with what they take to be a dogmatic belief in something that, from their perspective, lacks evidence, scientific evidence in particular, and passions tend to run very high. And, of course, this is not news, and it's not anything new in the sense that there has been religious conflict almost for as long as there have been human beings, I suppose.
So is the concept of heaven and hell, is that concomitant with this debate about God or no God?
Well, it certainly is a major concern for people on both sides of the issue, I suppose. And I don't know if that is really what ramps up the passions as much as people wanting to be right about it. It certainly is the grandest and I think perhaps the most important question of all, and everybody likes to be right when it comes to big questions and small questions and substantial and insubstantial questions. So being right about a big question seems to be really at the heart of the conflict. And it's really, as the title of the book suggests, a question more than it is an answer, because in the book I try to make the case not against religious belief or in favor of it, though I consider myself to be an atheist, an honest atheist as I call it, but rather to show that there is always uncertainty when it comes to the question of God, and we do ourselves a service individually and as members of a community to simply admit that there is uncertainty.
Do religions, and religions are big institutions, let's be honest about it, one of the most important overarching institutions in virtually every culture, not all, some do not allow it, but do religions feel that we need the concept of someone keeping score and holding us to account to keep us in line?
Well, that certainly is one of the roles that religion has played historically, right? The law can't be everywhere in all places, being enforced by the police, the courts, etc. And we can't even witness everyone's behavior all of the time. And so God, as a grand scorekeeper, has certainly been an important part of lots of religions, although religion is certainly more than that and deeper and more satisfying for many believers than simply God as a grand scorekeeper. And I suppose it's that picture of God as a grand scorekeeper that infuriates lots of non-believers, the idea of an invisible man in the sky watching us. I mean, as we record this, we're in the holiday season and the Christmas season, and Santa Claus and Elf on the Shelf play that role for lots of parents in getting their children into line, and we'd like to think that adults don't need that kind of potential scorekeeper or enforcer.
I come from the Jewish faith, and of course, God and one God has been what the Jewish faith has been founded on. But I'm wondering, with Christians, how different are they in terms of certainty, having the belief that we have been visited by God in the physical manifestation of Jesus? How different does that make a Christian's belief in God?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think there's a rich tradition of doubt that comes from the Jewish tradition and makes its way into Christianity in its best forms. I mean, if we think of the Jewish tradition in the Torah or the Old Testament, as some would call it, there is a long history of people doubting and straying from God and coming back and crying out, how can there be a God? And we see that in the best of Christianity as well. In fact, when we talk about faith, there really can't be faith without some kind of doubt. Pure certainty really isn't faith, right? Faith requires a commitment and a struggle with the concept of God and religion, and the best believers from Thomas Merton to Mother Teresa have struggled with their belief, and it's not always something that's crystal clear to them. They have to commit and recommit to it. And so I think that really the most authentic and sincere religious believers within Christianity, for sure, have within them the seeds of doubt. And one of the missions of my book is to make the case that an honest atheist needs to say that as well, that there is doubt in their atheism, that they need to reflect on the possibility of a God. It may not necessarily be the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but some concept of God, whether it be a creator or a deistic clockmaker, and admit that it's at least possible that there could be such a being, even if they don't happen to believe it. And really, it's a mark of strength in one's dialogue and intellectual honesty to append to their belief the appendix that I could be wrong.
But what about the physical manifestation of Jesus? I know when I go to a Christian service, it is so omnipresent, that conversation. And of course, when you step back and you go into the Old Testament and you look at the Jewish faith, obviously that's not at all a part of it. So we are all looking at this representation of God in different ways.
Oh, I see the point that you're driving at. Yeah, it's one of the marks of the Israelites in the Old Testament or the Torah that God's image is not to be made and is not physically represented in that way, and particularly in some Christian denominations, Catholicism, the tradition in which I was raised, there are all kinds of images, not only of Jesus but of the saints, and then there is lots of disagreement as to how literally we're supposed to interpret the images, how literally we're supposed to interpret the idea of the person of Jesus being resurrected. Certainly, these are the kinds of things that sincere believing Christians struggle with and will have some doubt about, no matter what their instruction may be. I think it's a mark of an insecure and perhaps immature faith when someone can't admit that there's room for doubt in what they've been instructed in and what most of the time perhaps they believe.
And you say that there is a gray area. A lot of people move back and forth between believing and not believing. Sometimes it's the nature of what's going on in your life, and you say there can't be a God because why would this occur? Why would my friend or my colleague or my partner get cancer? How could God let that happen? And is that more? Where do we fall on this continuum these days, particularly with many people leaving organized religion for a belief in something more spiritual?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and too many people perhaps embrace this kind of muscular idea of faith where it's absolutely certain and not to be doubted, and I suspect that even those people who put on that front or facade underneath it do vary in their degree of strength in their faith. I think of this in some ways as like when someone's driving and a radio signal. Sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's not, as you try to tune it into perhaps your car radio, and it has to come from both directions: the signal that is being sent and the tuner that's trying to receive it over the course of a person's life, as you say, given life events, right? Someone that's beloved comes down with cancer, you've been fired unjustly for a job, the person of faith may weaken in their ability to tune in the signal. And as you rightly note as well, it seems that there's a greater and greater trend for people away from organized religion, and one term that I've seen to describe such people are nuns, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E, right? They don't subscribe to any particular organized religion. Many of these people, though, still sometimes characterize themselves as spiritual, though not religious.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of that going on. If you look at some of the empty pews in America in particular, you know, we hear all these terms of evolution, creationism, intelligent design, Adam and Eve. I mean, the origins of this debate, do many people really think about this issue very seriously, or do they accept whatever tradition they have historically been born into without questioning? Do you think we're really questioning a lot more today? As your book suggests, as an interrogative, God is a question, not an answer. But do you think that we're really searching enough as a culture?
Well, I don't know if we could ever search enough, or certainly never search too much. I think it's a good thing. Multiculturalism, exposure to different points of view, people knowing people of other faiths, I think is very important. Not being just siloed or or bubbled in. And I think when you know someone who genuinely believes differently than you do, it raises the question. This is not a person who is an infidel or a blasphemer, but somebody who genuinely either has a different religious set of beliefs or non-beliefs and is nonetheless a good person. And it may direct you then to looking at what's right or wrong about the tradition in which you've been raised. And certainly as a philosophy professor by trade, that's something that I try to inculcate in my students. I don't indoctrinate them with believing anything in particular. I like to think that I try to teach them how to think rather than what to think, and really to ask this big question of, is there a God? And if so, what is it that we can know about him and justly believe?
Well, I know that you hear a lot of people saying, well, I think that God is the only thing that can give meaning and higher purpose. And yet there are others who say, look, I'm just going to be a good person. I'm going to do all the right things on earth, and I'll let the chips fall where they may and let theologians debate this argument, which is really unknowable, about the existence of a God.
Well, sure. If one has a God, particularly a God who is in the business of morality and pointing humans in a certain direction for what is called for in life, in a way that unburdens a person from having to come up with the answers for himself or impose answers on himself. And, well, the downside of that, of course, is that one may not particularly care for or resonate with the answers of morality given by one's religion. I think in particular of religions that may be quite patriarchal and perhaps not make a place for women or proper respect for women, in addition to just whatever other obligations may be imposed. On the flip side, a non-believer such as myself is in the position then of deciding on what basis they should live what most people would call a good life, and what purpose to give to oneself if there isn't a pre-given purpose. That's a more difficult road to tread, and I suppose the reason that some atheists come across as indignant or angry in the face of believers is that they can be self-congratulatory for taking what they see to be the harder path, the more difficult road, instead of recognizing the difficulty in life for everyone, no matter what road we choose.
There is a distinction, I would imagine, between non-believers and unbelievers.
Well, that's a good question, a good point. It really depends on how you split things, right? There are certainly a difference between agnostics and atheists, right? And I've been sometimes accused of trying to pass myself off as an atheist, whereas, well, you really sound more like an agnostic.
Well, because you're still questioning and asking
I'm still
people.
Questioning.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But I don't think that somebody who's still questioning and who's still open to possibly being wrong necessarily is an agnostic. I wouldn't call a believer an agnostic simply because they would admit in conversation that they could end up being wrong, that they do still ask the question, that they do speculate. And I think it's really a good role model that believers who are willing to entertain the questions and admit they can be wrong, that they serve a good role model in that way for atheists who need to admit that same thing for themselves. And an agnostic I tend to think of as somebody who genuinely does not know and really is back and forth about the issue in their own minds all the time and really throws up their hands and says they don't know, whereas the atheist says, I really don't think there is a God, but hopefully it pends to that, but I could be wrong, whereas the believer says, I really do believe there is a God, and hopefully it pends to that, but I could be wrong.
You say that we should consider it as a bet. as to whether we embrace the doubt of indifference or the doubt of desire. Can you explain those terms?
Yeah. So the doubt of indifference is really saying, you know what, I just don't care. There really is not a live doubt that's going on, whereas the doubt of desire is one that's seeking and open, right? So there are plenty of things about which I may have the doubt of indifference because they simply don't matter much to me. The exact number of stars in the universe, right? If you told me that you had calculated that or somebody had calculated that, I might doubt whether the calculation was accurate, but I wouldn't care very much about it. The doubt of desire recognizes that it's really a high-stakes question and issue about which one really needs to take things seriously and be concerned with it. Maybe even stay up late losing a night's sleep over it.
A critic online of yours said, the problem is, of course, that most atheists don't claim they know with absolute certainty that God doesn't exist. Many theists, though, claim the opposite, with much greater certainty. But putting that aside, how exactly could atheists impose their non-belief on others? And he questions whether you mean that we shouldn't favor the First Amendment, that we should allow prayers in all public schools. It is not atheists who impose their views on others, but religionists who think it's their duty to make their moral code into civil law. How do you look at that?
Well, I think the critic makes a good point in that historically speaking, it really has been religious believers who've been more inclined to impose their way of doing things on non-believers and those of other faiths. So that's perfectly true. But it's not a good reaction to that to say that, well, there's no way that I could possibly be wrong. And the person who's writing this is not a person I feel is in need of a whole lot of correction, because he rightly, I believe it's a he, rightly states that most atheists don't believe that it's an absolute certainty that there is no God. However, there are too many atheists who do come across, at least in public discourse and dialogue, as if it were a fully settled certainty. And it's true, as the critic points out on the other side, that there are religious believers who are equally dogmatic and unyielding in their view, but that doesn't make it a good idea to be unyielding in response. Basically, what I'm calling for in the book is civil discourse in which there's mutual respect, in which we don't misrepresent the other side, in which we don't approach and react to the other side with sarcasm and disdain, and ultimately, hopefully, a society in which we don't bubble in. Of course, this is a problem with regard to politics. And
well, I'm wondering whether this is a proxy war for our politics. God is a question, not an answer. Dr. William Irwin is with us, finding common ground in our uncertainty. Because there are those who might say that a lot of our political battles are based on the fact that there is such a strong movement of fundamentalists in America that doesn't exist in many other developed and Western countries. And so, is this not just another proxy war?
Sometimes it certainly is that. I mean, you can see the political lines drawn. Usually in terms of the liberal atheist and the conservative believer. And I think that is when a lot of the animosity comes out. And that's unfortunate, right? Because there really is much more to the issue than just being a proxy war for politics. And since it isn't necessarily one of politics, I mean, clearly, as we mentioned just a moment ago, in terms of the First Amendment and violations of the First Amendment, it's relevant and historically has been relevant. There really isn't great trouble in that area at the moment in terms of freedom of speech not being respected and freedom of religion not being respected in public schools and this sort of thing. And I certainly wouldn't be calling for prayer in public schools or any of those things that might be suspected of me. But the political implications it might be relevant in the sense that if we can bring our discourse into a more civil realm in this area and discussion of religion and belief, and learn to say I could be wrong and realize that's a mark of strength rather than a mark of weakness, perhaps we could see that transfer into the political realm as well, where it's certainly, unfortunately, in the rhetoric of our politics is never seen as a mark of strength when a politician or any talking head or pundit admits that they could be wrong.
And a gentle and generous God, would a God, and I know you're an atheist, but accept the fact that, people would have doubt on something that is so unknowable?
I certainly hope so. With tongue in cheek, as someone raised Catholic, I hold on to the hope of purgatory if I'm wrong on all of this, right? That I could get a second chance at it, and that I could certainly be forgiven for being honest and sincere in my non-belief or unbelief, or however we might term it, right? And I certainly think that is fitting with an all-loving God. There's also in some Christian theology the idea of the anonymous Christian, which in some ways can feel a little bit insulting to the non-believer or the person of another faith, that even though they don't have the Christian faith or accept Christian doctrine, that they are nonetheless safe as an anonymous Christian. This is really characteristic of mid and early 20th century Christian theology, but it is nonetheless a nice thought that there is a way of making a place for the non-believer, and the current Pope has been open on that idea as well, that it wouldn't necessarily be damnation in store for the atheist.
The Trappist monk Thomas Merton wrote, and I know you quoted in a piece, that faith is a decision, a judgment that is fully and deliberately taken in the light of a truth that cannot be proven. It is not merely the acceptance of a decision that has been made by somebody else. So that puts a lot of responsibility on us to really think through these issues.
Yeah, I believe it does, right? I mean, faith, as Merton characterizes it, is a decision in the light of uncertainty, right? If a decision is easy and without any question and without any doubt, well, then there's nothing much of at stake or in store with that, or really nothing even to debate. So I really do appreciate Merton's description, and it's something that should resonate for believers, at least those who are honest about the insecurity of their belief, and it should resonate with non-believers as well.
You write that ecumenical and interfaith religious dialogue has increased substantially in our age. So are we getting more tolerant not only of each other and our differences as it relates to ethnicity and race and the like, but also as it relates to religion? Do you see at least something that might have been a hardened boundary before softening?
Well, it isn't straightforward progress, right? I mean, as we come more into contact and deal with one another more, I think that does soften the boundaries and make for greater acceptance, and we see less of a need or desire for trying to convert the other to our religion or our stance. But that certainly doesn't speak to the whole trend, right? It's no secret that religious conflict continues to flare up and continues to be bloody. We can only hope that the arc of progress bends in the right direction, to paraphrase badly, as I'm trying to Martin Luther King Jr.
What about the notion that perhaps, if for no other reason, we want to keep this as an open question so that we don't find ourselves in conflict, hot conflict about this, since we have fought so many battles over the years about this question?
That mindset, I'm hopeful, really does point in that direction, right? That if we could admit that we don't know with certainty, and that another's belief or non-belief is not a threat to us, then that cools things down a little bit and makes us less likely to feel that we need to change the other, or that the other in some way represents a threat to us. Live and let live, coexist.
Well, I like the fact that you're making God a question and not an answer, because I think if anybody is honest with themselves, they would say that this is a really difficult one, and one worth a lot of study and reflection. And I thank you for coming by today, Dr. William Irwin. God is a question, not an answer, finding common ground in our uncertainty. Where can people find the book?
Well, you can find it online at Amazon and all those good places, barnesandnoble.com, and hopefully in your local Barnes & Noble or whatever bookstore may be nearby.
All right. Thank you again for joining us today on America Trends.
Thank you for having me, Larry.